Hey CY, and welcome again to our teaching series in God's Big Picture. I hope you guys have been enjoying the series so far and it's all starting to fit together. As usual, we'll have a quick recap of where we are so far. So, after the fall, when humans ruined God's good creation, God promised a man named Abraham that he would make things right again. Why don't you turn to your neighbor and tell them what the four components of God's... I'm just kidding, we've done that enough, we'll just go straight into it. Last week we looked at the Exodus, God's people escaping from slavery in Egypt. After they crossed the Red Sea, they were given the law in the Ten Commandments, and they built the tabernacle where God's presence would be with them. And we saw how this partially fulfilled God's first two promises, to raise up a people and to bless them. That took us to the end of Leviticus, to give his people a place or a land to live in, that's in Numbers to Joshua, and a king to rule over them, in Judges to Chronicles. So that's where we're going today. We're still in the partial kingdom, God partially fulfilling his promises to Abraham through the history of Israel. Back in Genesis 12, God said to Abraham, "To your offspring I will give this land." And the books of Numbers to Joshua tell us how this came true. So, having received God's law in the Ten Commandments, the Israelites are now ready to move into the Promised Land. But the book of Numbers is actually a record of disobedience and delay. It's really quite depressing. The Israelites start complaining and grumbling from the moment they set out. They send scouts into Canaan and they come back with this report: the land is flowing with milk and honey. But instead of being excited to take the land, they're terrified of the people who live there, and they say they would have been better off if they had just stayed in Egypt. And because of their complaining and ingratitude, God says that all of that generation, except for the faithful Caleb and Joshua, will die before they enter the land. Now you may have heard that they were wandering around the desert for 40 years, but given the distance, the journey should have only taken a few months. Next in the Deuteronomy you have both blessings and curses. It takes us to the plains of Moab by the river Jordan, actually overlooking Canaan. The next generation is just about to enter the land, and Moses speaks to the people one last time before he dies. He says, "Don't make the same mistakes that we made." And the stakes are high, because on one hand, if they obey God, they'll be blessed. He says in Deuteronomy 28, "If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all nations on earth." And yet on the other hand, if they aren't faithful to God, he will curse them. He says later in that chapter, "You will be uprooted from the land you are entering to possess." Then Moses dies and Joshua takes his place. And the book of Joshua is all about conquest and uncertainty. Under Joshua, the Israelites finally enter Canaan. God miraculously enables them to defeat the Canaanites and take the land for themselves. And we're reminded here that this is all God keeping his promises to Abraham. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. And we're also told, not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. So God's kingdom has been partially established. We have God's people in God's place, under God's rule, and enjoying his blessing. And we think, mission accomplished, right? But as the book of Joshua comes to a close, there is also a word of warning. Just like Moses, before Joshua dies, he preaches a parting sermon to the people, urging them to keep the commandments and fear God. He warns them, "But if you turn away, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out the nations from before you." And worse than that, he says that they will be expelled, kicked out of the land. And so as the book of Joshua comes to an end, we have this question mark looming overhead, and we wonder, will the people keep the covenant and prosper, or will they disobey and be kicked out of the land? Next we look at God's king, the promise. We're in Judges to Chronicles, and if you were with us last year, we looked at the book of Judges. What happens is that just before the people enter the land, Moses tells them what the kingship will look like. The first part is that the king is to rule under God. He is to be God's man. He is to submit to God and read God's word daily so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God. So the promise of a king is really part of God's promised rule and blessing. The blessing comes to the people as God rules in his kingdom through his king. So that's the promise, but how does it play out? Well, in the next few books of the Bible, again, we only see a partial fulfillment. In the book of Judges, the people are now in the promised land, but we see this cycle of sin and grace. Joshua has died, and what happens next is actually pretty depressing. Instead of listening to the warnings that Moses and Joshua gave before they died, the people rebel against God's rule. And then we see just a huge mess. The same cycle is repeated over and over and over again, and the judges get worse and worse and worse. Israel sins and serves other gods. God judges them and lets their enemies defeat them. In desperation, they cry to him for mercy, and God provides a judge or a ruler. And God uses these judges to bring peace to the land, but it never lasts long. The people soon sin again and the cycle repeats. Well, the last words of the book of Judges tell us both the problem and the solution. We're told, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And we're left thinking, oh man, if only they had a king. So we go on to 1 Samuel, which begins with a false start. A few years later, the Israelites approach the last judge, Samuel, and they say, "Appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." And God is angry at this request, not because they wanted a king, but because their motivation in asking for one was wrong. You see, they want a king instead of God, like all the other nations have, rather than a king under God, like the one Moses talked about, who would be God's man, who would be God's king, and who would submit to him. And even though their request is sinful, God actually gives them what they ask for, and Saul is anointed king. But soon Saul turns away from God and he's rejected by him, and then Samuel anoints David as king. God's choice for king. And David defeats the giant Philistine Goliath, and we see that God's presence is with him. But instead of David being crowned king as we might expect, Saul stays on as king and David has to run away. And here we see that it's only after suffering and rejection that the Lord's anointed enters his glory. And of course 1,000 years later it was the same for Jesus Christ. And then in 2 Samuel, Saul dies and David becomes king, and Israel enjoys peace and prosperity like they've never experienced before. But even this is still not the fulfillment. There will be a greater king. And God makes this clear in 2 Samuel 7, that God's covenant promises will be fulfilled not by David, but by a future king. He will be a descendant of David and a son of God. God says, "I will be his father and he will be my son. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." Finally, we get to 1 Kings chapters 1 to 11, Solomon and the Golden Age. Solomon is David's son, and at first it looks like he is the fulfillment of this king we've been waiting for. Under him the land enjoys peace and prosperity, and he replaces the tabernacle, which was a tent of God's presence, with a glorious temple. And this is as good as it gets in Israel's history. So if we look back at our theme of God's kingdom, the partial kingdom has been established. God's people, the Israelites, are in God's place, Canaan, under God's rule, his law and king, and enjoying God's blessing. But tragically and frustratingly, it doesn't last. Solomon himself turns from the Lord, and the partial kingdom starts to fall apart. It's sad, but it's not the end of the story, because this whole partial kingdom was just a model and a shadow that pointed forward to a greater reality. It looked forward to the bigger and better version, which is King Jesus and the perfect kingdom that God would establish through him. But we're not quite there yet, and before we get to Jesus, we're going to look at the prophets who look forward to Jesus and filled in the details about this king that was to come. That's what we're looking at, not next week, because next week we have our fake news or good news topical. But in 2 weeks, we're looking at the prophesied kingdom. We'll see you then.